I'd love to get started. I know we have a lot to cover. Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephanie Wolf, and I am the Membership Relations Coordinator at Population Connection. It's great to have you all here and to see so many familiar names in the chat box. I can't thank you enough for your continued support, especially in these uncertain times. Today's event, What Happens Next? A discussion on the future of reproductive rights and family planning post-election, is hosted by Population Connection Action Fund. On the call presenting, we have our President and CEO, John Seager. John has been a guest lecturer at more than 80 colleges and has spoken to numerous environmental, religious, and community groups across the United States. He's a veteran of more than 50 political campaigns. Also joining us is Brian Dixon, Senior Vice President for Governmental and Political Affairs. He oversees the organization's advocacy and political work. Before joining our team, he worked on several congressional campaigns and served as a legislative aide on Capitol Hill. Now, if you have any questions for John and Brian, please drop them in the Q&A box that is found at the bottom of your screen. We will do our very best to get those answered, along with any questions that were sent in with your registration during the Q&A portion, which will be facilitated by our senior analyst, Hannah Evans. And for any questions we don't have time to answer live, we will provide written answers along with a recording of this presentation, the presentation slides, and access to the chat box discussion. Now, at this time, that's it for me. I will go ahead and send it over to you, Brian, to get us started.
Thanks, Stephanie, and thanks everyone for joining us. When we first scheduled this briefing, I naively thought I was going to be talking about all the big plans we had for the next 2 years and all the great strides forward we were going to make. Sadly, it's a different conversation. But before we get too into it, I just want to lay out a little bit. I mean, the overall results, of course, from our point of view, are going to make life for the next couple of years very challenging. But I think it's also important to realize that this, especially in the presidential race, this is going to end up being like an unbelievably close election, well under a 2-point margin in the popular vote for the president in the presidential election. The House is probably, the Republicans in the House are going to have the smallest majority margin since the United States has had 50 states, 220 or 221 seats. Takes 218 to be to win the majority. They might have 3 over that, but 3 of those seats are going to be vacant immediately, it looks like. So we're talking about really narrow margins there. And so in addition to being really close, there were a lot of really mixed messages that came out of this election. At the same time, voters were electing a federal government that's incredibly hostile to the issues we care about: reproductive rights, environmental protection. Voters in 7 states, and it would have been 8 if not for a 60% requirement in Florida, voters in 7 states adopted abortion rights protections to their state constitutions. And they elected Democratic leaders in places like North Carolina, state leaders in places like North Carolina while they were electing Trump. So I think there's some silver linings here. It's the close elections and the mixed messages, but also we know from polling we did during this election that people agree with us on the issues and on our values. We did some polling earlier in the fall that found that 86% of people agree with the idea that not everybody wants children, and those people deserve opportunities to explore their careers and passions. That 86% represents a core national value. And the same thing, it's also a core value, the idea that people should be trusted to make their own decisions about when and if to have children. We also did some polling of voters in this 2024 election and found that 68% of the voters in this election agree with us that the global gag rule is bad and shouldn't be in place. They agree that it's wrong for the United States government to force healthcare providers around the world to limit the advice that they can give their patients about abortion. So that's another silver lining. And sort of my own personal silver lining, sort of a jokey one, is that one of the benefits of this is it seems like we're never going to have to hear from J.D. Vance again, since he seems to have been disappeared since Election Day. Now, I don't mean to suggest that this is all going to be, I don't mean to be sugarcoating this, because it definitely creates a number of challenges. We expect the global gag rule to be put back into place within the first week of the new administration taking office. We expect that threats to reproductive freedom at home to be ramped up. Things like access to mifepristone or medication abortion, and access to their being targeted. 3 Republican attorney generals, even before the election, filed a lawsuit seeking to restrict access to mifepristone and to ban it outright for anyone under 18. And we expect the GOP, the new majority, to look at using an archaic law known as the Comstock Act to ban distribution of this important medicine through the mail. And you probably heard about Project 2025 before the election, but let me just tell you a little bit about what that's calling for. It calls for the elimination of any mention, wherever any mention of sexual and reproductive health and rights appears in law or policy or regulation or international agreement. They want that erased. Calls for the elimination of programs and staff dedicated to gender equality and/or women's economic empowerment. It calls for the U.S. to begin to collaborate with some of the most oppressive human rights regimes in the world to undermine access to reproductive health care and family planning by restoring something that the Trump administration undertook in its first term called the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which was a declaration but had no consensus. It was a small group of countries that agreed to the things I just mentioned. And of course, it calls to ban funding to UNFPA and the creation of a hit list of organizations around the world that support abortion rights in order to bar them from any future US government funding. So that's what we're facing. I do want to take a little bit of time just to brag a bit about the work that Population Connection Action Fund did in this election. Our Fight for Her campaign had people on the ground in Arizona, in Tucson and Phoenix, in Nevada, in Las Vegas, in Columbus, Ohio, in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania, and in New Hampshire, where they were knocking on doors and canvassing and talking to people about the importance of voting and getting out to vote and defending our champions in these places. The Action Fund also endorsed a bunch of candidates. Of the 23 Senate candidates we endorsed, 18 of them were elected. And of the 98 House candidates we endorsed, 91 of them were elected. So that's, I think, a really solid record. That said, some of those losses are really painful and important. Folks like John Tester in Montana and Sherrod Brown in Ohio from the Senate, and Susan Wild in Pennsylvania, all of whom have been really reliable champions for the work we do and the issues we all care about. And they're going to be greatly missed. Also, a last plug, not defeated in this election, but we are also losing the leader in the House of the Foreign Operations Subcommittee, who has been a great champion for us, fought for increased funding for family planning, led the fight to end the global gag rule, is the primary sponsor of the Global Her Act, Barbara Lee, who ran for the Senate in California and was defeated in the Democratic primary. She's finishing up her time in Congress. She's going to be very difficult to replace. So our work is cut out for us, but I think there's hope. Although I hate to say that because I had hope before the election only to see it dashed. I will also say, looking at some of the cabinet appointments that are being sent down, they're pretty frightening. Crackpots and kooks for many of them, people like Bobby Kennedy Jr. for the director of HHS, who even the New York Post editorial board said is an embarrassment as a nomination for this job, is a dangerous conspiracy theorist who threatens public health across this country. So I think what's going to happen there remains to be seen. With such small margins, how Republican senators react to this is an open question. I'm skeptical that they're going to do the right thing, just given what's been happening for the past 8 years, but there could be enough pressure. If enough pressure can be generated, it could be possible to hold back some of the worst of these. So people like Bobby Kennedy and Matt Gaetz from Florida, who has been under federal investigation for sex trafficking and is the nominee and Trump's choice to be the head of the Justice Department. Anyway, with that, I will turn it over to John and then look forward to a conversation later with questions.
Thanks, Brian. Before I get to a brief PowerPoint set of slides to talk a little bit about what some other factors, I'll just mention really two things I hear, just to put a number on something Brian pointed out. Our teams in those 6 places knocked on more than 138,000 doors. Old-fashioned shoe leather canvassing. We won some, we lost some, but I still believe that face-to-face personal contact is really important, and I'm proud of what our team did in that regard. The other thing I will mention, and this makes me sound even older than I am, if that's possible, but I worked in my first political campaign 60 years ago. I spent about 20 years of my life working directly in politics. We won some, we lost some, and the one thing I learned along the way was victory or defeat, the next day you get up and you get back to work. And that's really the key. You don't spend a lot of time thinking you're all that smart when you win. When you lose, you learn a lot and you learn what you need to do differently, and then you figure it out and move forward. So in that regard, I'm optimistic. I'm certainly not optimistic about this administration. An enormous number of things that matter and people that matter are going to be hurt terribly, and that's just a hard fact of life. I will mention that at the moment in the House, with the very narrow margin, there are 10 Republicans who won by or are winning by 3% or less, and they're going to have to stand for re-election in 2 years. I also will just note, as a matter of history, it wasn't so long ago, several decades ago, that there were a substantial number of Republicans in the House and Senate who supported programs like family planning. And frankly, at that time, there were Democrats who weren't on our side. The world has changed. There are now 2 senators on the Republican side, Senators Murkowski and Collins, who generally vote the right way. They each have their own issues and challenges, but generally they do. And the one Democrat who wasn't helpful to us is now Joe Manchin, has now been replaced by a Republican. And in the House, it's strictly pretty much a party line situation these days. I wish Republicans would come back around, but that hasn't happened to date. Let me move into a presentation here if I can get the right buttons up. Let's see. I'm not seeing the share button. There's the share button right there. I hope that's showing up. A picture of the once and future president, or a photo depicting him, shall we say. There's certainly nothing funny about what he's doing, but you know, we need to retain our sense of humor, even in the darkest times. And what it depicts, and this was from his last go round, time for a change, and that's true in more ways than one in that picture. But he did shred efforts to protect the climate, and you can expect him to do it again. That's a virtual certainty that that's going to happen. But that leads me to kind of one of my central points today. is that the President of the United States is arguably the most powerful person on earth. But there are things presidents can't control. They can't change the laws of physics. They can't change how chemical reactions occur. Those are things that go forward regardless. And they can't change the fact, at least not immediately, that we're adding 70 million people to the population of planet Earth every year. Those are just facts, and those facts are going to continue. The other key fact here, which kind of comes from a slightly different direction, and it's probably the most important thing we've learned since our founding in 1968, we now know for certain that when women are truly empowered, when they have choices and they have reproductive autonomy, most of them choose to have smaller families. And nowhere around the world have those trends reversed substantially once they've occurred. And certainly there are efforts going forward in Korea, in Japan, in Russia, and elsewhere, and I'm sure here, to try to get women to shift back to having large families. Those efforts are almost certainly doomed to failure because that's not what most women want with their lives. So we do have kind of some of that on our side as we move forward. I would note when it comes to population, size really does matter. That's a photo, a depiction, if you will, of the Titanic as opposed to a modern cruise ship. The world has changed a lot in the last 100+ years. And one of the big changes, of course, as we all know, has been the growth of population. And that simple fact matters a great deal. As we go forward, and these are the UN numbers, and I'm not getting into a long sort of population talk per se, there are a lot of different projections, no predictions, just projections. And all of them indicate that we're going to continue to see population growth. That middle line in the red is the median line. It represents the UN's sort of best, if you will, projection as what may happen. And, that does show, if it happens, and that's very much an open question, that later in the century, population will peak. But that may not happen. Those numbers all depend on all kinds of things that are yet to be seen in this world. But even so, we've got to look at what's happening. And around climate change, the goal for 2030, we're looking at a reduction of 45% in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 as compared to 2010. In fact, it's going the other direction. It's gone up. Instead of heading down on that trajectory, they're going up. They've gone up 9% since 2010. And on a kind of personal level, if you will, even if you try to do your very best and you try to eat lower on the food chain and you try to be responsible, the fact is that unless you're growing those tomatoes yourself and you're growing the wheat yourself, what you're consuming when you consume food is you're essentially consuming petrochemicals. The petrochemicals required to grow the food, the petrochemicals required to transport the food. That's just a fact of life at this point. And hopefully we will see more and more technologies emerging to address this, but there is less and less evidence to support the idea that technology is going to solve this problem quickly enough. The main goal with climate change has been net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. That is a mirage at this point. Maybe there'll be some incredible breakthrough 3, 5, 10 years from now, but it's highly unlikely. And frankly, we're not moving anywhere near fast enough in the right direction. In some ways, we're slipping ever further back. If you look, for example, at coal production, that line at the top, that red line, shows what's happening with China. China is increasing its coal production even as some other places on Earth are reducing it, and they're a very important factor. India's demand for electricity is estimated to increase by 9-fold by 2050. And it's exacerbated by the fact that temperatures are rising. When you're dealing with temperatures of 120 degrees Fahrenheit, you need air conditioning. People just can't survive at a certain point. And most of the power, in fact, an increasing share of the power in India to power electricity comes from coal. Their coal use is increasing, not decreasing. Looking at Russia, Putin said we could spend less on fur coats and the grain harvest would go up. Russia is located in a northern region. As temperatures rise, grain yields are going to go up in Russia, not down. They're going to go somewhat down in the United States. They're going to increase a bit in Canada. But Russia stands to benefit greatly in terms of its agriculture from global warming. Now, I'll leave it to you to decide whether Putin is the kind of person who's going to put the needs and interests of the planet ahead of anything that will increase his power as a dictator. But this is just a fact that we have to deal with. And all of these facts are things that don't change because Donald Trump is president. We're going to have to deal with these realities. And when we look at population growth around the world, most of the attention is often on Africa, which is where you are seeing rapid population growth. But we also need to remember that there are many different possibilities going forward in the more developed regions on Earth, such as the United States and Western Europe. And you can see from this UN projection that there's a wide different set of different possibilities and arrays in terms of where our population trajectories are going to go. And this becomes ever more important when we look at the situation involving climate, because more people means more emissions. I'm repeating something that I think we all know, but I think it's really critical that we do know how to meet the population challenge. If you go back to 1960, we saw a roughly 50% reduction in family size in less than 2 decades in the United States. And since then, we've remained basically around replacement rate. In fact, we're significantly below it these days. There's no question that a number of the policies that are going to come forward under this administration are going to, one way or another, attempt to move that up. But I don't think women are going to have it. I'm sure that they're going to fight as hard as they can, and their allies, men, should stand alongside them and fight as hard as we can to make sure that the choices that most, but not all, American women have today aren't taken away from them. And that's clearly what this administration wants to try to do. One kind of last word about climate change. Most of the discussions, most of the efforts involve one form of technology, traditionally spoken of, or another. Wind power, photovoltaics, the carbon capture with coal, which is really a phony solution, frankly. Coal is coal. But what gets almost no attention, and I hate to say it, but this is true even of our good friends in the environmental community, is that the single least expensive way to reduce CO2 emissions is by investing in family planning. Look at the numbers. The second most cost-effective method is girls' education. And yet, when you try to bring this up in many quarters, you get no response. I'm hoping that as more people who care about climate change come to realize that we're simply moving in the wrong direction, that we're not getting where we need to go fast enough, that there's going to be increased attention on family planning and girls' education. Now, to be sure, this administration will work as hard as it can to torpedo these things, but we do need to start thinking differently about this. If there's one lesson to come out of this election, is we need to stop and rethink some of the approaches we've been taking, because in various ways they haven't been working. They haven't been working in terms of election results, and they haven't been working in terms of addressing climate. And we've got to go back to first principles and figure out what we can do to turn those things around. And there's no better time to kind of try to figure that out than when you're out of power and you're trying to figure out what to do when you can get back in. So, those are the kind of things I just wanted to mention before I open it up to questions and discussion. I just want to emphasize 2 things. A lot is going to change. But for us as an organization, two things are not going to change. We are going to continue to be the resource for population education in the United States. You can see the numbers here. We've trained over 107,000 educators on nearly 500 college campuses. We're actually adding staff, several staff. We're doing more. We're expanding that program. We think it's so important that the next generation recognize the challenges we face. And we're also going to continue to do what we've been doing with advocacy. We didn't win all the battles we fought this year, but we fought some hard battles. We won some hard battles, and we lost some tough ones as well. But we believe in grassroots power. We believe in young people. We believe that we can come back and get back to where we need to go as long as we rethink some of our tactics and strategies, but maintain our core principles. And so with that, I will wrap it up, and we'll go to questions and comments. I will pull my screen down, I guess, at this point, if I can figure out how. There we go. All right.
Perfect. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Brian and John. That was a great presentation. Very interesting. We've got plenty of time for questions. So any of you in the audience, if you'd like something answered live with Brian and John here, please feel free to voice that in the chat, and we will get to as many questions as we have time for today. I'm just going to jump right in. John, I wanted to just touch on something that you mentioned in the very end of your presentation, speaking about the sort of cost effectiveness of funding family planning within the context of CO2 emissions reductions. And we know that it's also one of the most potentially viable or successful solutions to reducing CO2 emissions in the short and long term. But you mentioned that there's really not so much of a political will to kind of integrate family planning into climate solutions. But I'm wondering, are there in political spheres any politicians or movements amongst any political groups that are seeking to kind of integrate these two themes and really work to address the unmet need from not only a human rights perspective, but also one of climate mitigation?
Well, books could be written on that, and some have been. What I would say is two things. One, to sort of reiterate something I mentioned, which is that, look, I don't want to, I admire and respect our friends in the environmental community. We have our disagreements, but that happens even among the best of friends. They're smart people. They know that net zero by 2050 is a mirage. They know this. These are smart people. They realize that some new approaches need to be taken. And what we're going to do our best is to get that in front of them, show them the facts. One of the barriers has been that when you link efforts to increase access to family planning in, for example, sub-Saharan Africa with climate change, you often get accused of being a racist. Like we white North Americans are trying to force Black Africans to have fewer children. Nothing could be further from the truth. And one of the key things here, because all we're trying to do here is to remove the barriers that are now in place that prevent women in Africa who don't want to be pregnant from being able to control and manage their own fertility. One of the keys here is not, frankly, it's not somebody who looks like me who's going to be able to make this case effectively. We need to lift up voices in the global South. We're doing that in many ways. We just this week, we added Florence Blondell to our staff. She's Ugandan. She's been a leading spokesperson on these issues. She's somebody who has worked on this and understands it. And I think it's very important to have voices like Florence, voices like Melvin Oyo, who's the vice chair of our board, who's a Kenyan who works in Kenya, so that we start to help get people who are in less developed countries stand up and say, we see the connections between overpopulation and climate change and the need for family planning. And hopefully that will help to remove the impediment that exists there now. So it's a combination of people realizing that the current plan isn't working and also reducing the resistance to it by getting people who are people of color, who are experts, who are willing to stand up and say, this is really important.
Yeah, great. Wonderful. It's kind of one of the biggest issues I think we're facing as an organization, at least in my work within it, is to kind of make clear the connections between all of these issues, the environmental and the human rights ones, in ways that really promotes human rights-based advocacy. But there's a lot of potential there, especially in the space of climate change and mitigation. So thank you, John. Brian, I'm wondering, so you were talking a lot about the sort of political situation in which we are now immersed, and part of all of this has to do with kind of the realization of facts versus non-facts, and what the truth is, right? And there's a question here asking about that, saying that there is the truth that has actually become a belief that has been guided by someone who's not necessarily in a position to speak the truth often. So how can we reclaim the truth and fact-based information in ways that is going to facilitate a better future?
I appreciate the simple questions.
It's a big question.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I knew the answer to that. I know a lot of people are looking into the whole sort of information environment that's out there, and the skewed media message environment going on, that how do we get, when you have podcasts that reach 35 million people whose sole objective is to spread misinformation, what is there to counter that? And I'm not sure I have an answer to that yet. I think we need to, not just we as an organization or as a movement, but like we as a country need to sort of get a firmer grasp of how social media and how all of this scattered ways of communicating is having an impact that we haven't yet foreseen, and how do we address it? But I think it's sort of a fundamental question. There does not seem to be, I mean, even in the past when you had massive disagreements, there weren't like huge disagreements about basic facts. And now there seems to be. I mean, vaccines is like the clearest example of this. I mean, vaccines have saved millions and millions and millions of lives, and now yet somehow we're now in a state where the nominee to run the Department of Health and Human Services is an opponent of vaccines. And that's all of this, I think, is a challenge. Like, how did we get to a point where, every person in America almost everyone in America uses contraceptives at some point in their lives, and yet we're having fights about whether it should be available to people. Nobody, I mean, the only people who think contraceptives should be restricted have like podcasts or talk radio shows, or have somehow gotten themselves elected to Congress. I think people are going to be in for a shock about what they're actually getting out of this election versus what they meant to get. So I'm not answering your question very well, mainly because I don't know the answer of how we're going to get back to that, being able to having shared facts.
I'll take a quick crack at it. I wasn't asked, but that never stopped me before. Right before COVID, and I think we have somebody on the line who I was meeting with that day in San Francisco. I was walking, I forget, maybe down Haight Street, one of the streets there, and I had this sudden thought, and I have so few, I remember having it. And there's that old saying from the 60s, Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. Well, the messenger is often the message. And I think this sort of harkens back to what I was saying a minute or two ago about climate. I think one of the things we have to work on is to make sure that we are enlisting and uplifting the right messengers. People are much more likely to be receptive to any message if it comes from somebody who has walked in their shoes, somebody who's facing some of the same kinds of challenges they do, some of the same circumstances. And I think, frankly, and I'm a lifelong Democrat, I think sometimes we've gotten away from that a little bit and sort of acted like know-it-alls and sort of lectured people on what they should or shouldn't do. And I think there are ways to get around that. And I'll give you a great example. There's a new member of Congress from Delaware. Delaware only has one House member, Sarah McBride. She's the first transgender member of Congress. And a right-wing Congresswoman, Nancy Mace, is making a big deal this week about trying to bar Sarah McBride from using women's restrooms on the Hill. And Sarah McBride isn't taking the bait. She's not taking it. She said, that's not what we should be talking about. We should be talking about people's economic welfare, about how we can make their lives better, how we can make sure that people can afford housing and afford food and have a decent life. And so I think a lot of this is not failing to defend basic human rights, but also not get pulled into conversations that get away from the core issues that matter to people the most, and make sure that the messengers are people who are credible and who people are willing to listen to. Whether that will overcome the nightmare that is social media, I don't really know, but it's a good place to start.
Yeah, thank you. It's such a big question and topic, and something that I think is on all of our minds and increasingly relevant, and in ways that are becoming so pervasive, and it's also sort of unprecedented to find ourselves in these political situations. With regards to RFK, Brian, you spoke a little bit about him, and there's a question in the chat just asking about, I mean, of course, we understand his very problematic views in terms of vaccines and infectious disease, among other things, but what about his stance on reproductive rights and choice? What do you think the implications of him heading the HS, will be in terms of reproductive rights, domestically?
Well, I'm not sure how pro-choice he really is anymore. I mean, he used to be, but I know that during the campaign, he certainly was open. He said that he was certainly open to the Republicans' efforts to ban abortion. And I also think even if he hadn't said that, I don't think he would be I don't think he would be getting this job if he hadn't privately agreed to stand by and let them do whatever they want to do on this issue. So I think his on access to reproductive health and abortion specifically in this country, I think his the implications of his being at HHS would be nothing. But I think the implications on a whole range of other health issues would be enormous.
Thank you. So, John, I'm wondering too if you could speak to the role of men within family planning. We're switching gears a little bit here, but there's a few questions kind of asking about this. And the overarching kind of premise here is that, restrictions on reproductive rights are heavily patriarchal, and that they are men aiming to control women's bodies. And one way around that, and to maybe shift paradigms, is to include men in initiatives towards and in support of family planning. So what role do you see men playing here? And there's a question actually asking specifically if Population Connection would ever consider a campaign that actually focuses on men's roles in reproductive responsibility.
Well, certainly there's a lot, there's a lot to unpack here. And I've always been kind of two minds about the issue in the following way. I absolutely believe that men bear, great, however one wants to define it, responsibility, obviously. But I also think that no woman on earth should ever have to depend on any man for the reproductive trajectory of her life. So it's sort of a bit of a not exactly a conundrum, but yes, men should wise up and start acting responsibly. But in the meantime, and I think there's going to be a meantime, women shouldn't be victimized by the fact that that hasn't happened. That said, the programs that operate, for example, the programs the U.S. government has funded in sub-Saharan Africa do reach out to men and to women, to boys and to girls. And we, through our Global Partners program, provide very modest funding for some programs along those lines. So it's critical, but I also think, and maybe, I don't know if Brian has some good numbers on this. I don't recall them from that survey, but men, have certainly in many cases been very supportive of women's rights, of the right to access. So, those are kind of key aspects of this. It's absolutely important that men step up and start taking more responsibility. But as that's happening, women shouldn't have to be victimized in the meantime. It's an interesting question. If you have X dollars to spend in a world with limitations, how much of that goes to filling unmet needs for contraception, and how much of it goes toward educating boys and men? You should do both, but sometimes you have to kind of make some choices there. And to me, the more we can do to uplift and empower women, and I think a good start would have been to elect the first woman president, would have been a good place to start, the better. I'm not sure that's a great answer, but it's the only one I've got right now.
No, that's great. Thank you. And there's another question just kind of following up on this. And it's perhaps a subjective and personal question, but you can speak to the numbers behind it as well of why do you think so many women are not currently using modern contraception?
Well, first of all, in the United States, about 99%, last time I saw a number of women who are sexually active, heterosexual, use modern contraception. Among Catholics, the last number I saw, it plummets to 98%. So it doesn't really, religion is not a factor in that regard in the United States. The key statistic that I like to put forward comes from our friends at Guttmacher. There are 218 million women in low and middle income countries who do not want to be pregnant at present, but who are not using modern contraception. The number one reason they cite, not the only reason, but the number one reason is fear of side effects, which when I first learned this years ago surprised me. I assumed it would have been either cost or outside interference. But fear of side effects is a very sophisticated, it's an interesting problem because it involves two dimensions. One, a woman might have walked 3 or 4 hours to a clinic only to discover there's only one method available there. She takes that method, but then it's problematic for her for one reason or another. It could be as simple as her mother-in-law finding the birth control pills, and her mother-in-law wants her to have lots of children, or it could be some other physiological factor. She goes back to the clinic, but there's no other methods available. The other factor involved is misinformation, either deliberate or otherwise. Often these are women who have very limited, almost no education. They are in a situation where they don't have access to information. They're told things that aren't true. And in both cases, it kind of comes down to what you might call a logistical last mile problem. You can have the greatest technology in the world, but if you can't reach people where they are, if you can't create an environment of trust, if you can't make sure that they are comfortable with the information and they have ready access to the services, all the technology in the world isn't going to work. By the way, I just noted a comment that came in from our newest staff member, Florence Blundell, who did her thesis on this very topic. So what I think we should do, and I'll mention this to Stephanie, I think having a future session where Florence can share that information, because I can assure you she knows more about it than I do.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Again, really big questions here. So I appreciate both of you just taking the time to kind of really tease out a lot of the details associated with these issues that we're all facing. In respect to that, Brian, I'm just going to go to you and ask a question that was submitted here, which is asking just more broadly from a policy perspective, what key strategies there are for safeguarding access to reproductive health care services.
Yeah, well, I think, first and foremost, I think making sure that the people of this country that are informed of what's happening, able to generate the kind of grassroots pressure. As John mentioned earlier, there's a lot of members of Congress, especially on the Republican side, who have won their elections by very narrow margins. And they're going to be asked to approve policies that an overwhelming number of their constituents have no interest in having done. So generating pressure on those folks and making them take public stands, I think, is going to be crucial. I mean, there's no magic strategy for protecting these rights. It's a long, hard, constant struggle, and we're committed to seeing it through. We're gonna, our action fund is going to be working with our grassroots to make calls, to send letters, to see legislators when they go home, to engage with them whenever they can, to make it clear where they stand on this. And we're going to be looking to our friends that are left in Congress to carry the fight there, in committees and on the floor. To if they want to do these things, let's make them do it publicly. Now, we're not going to let them get away with trying to ban these services without any public attention. So I think there's this old phrase, it's sort of cliche now, sunlight is the best disinfectant. But if we can make it clear what they're doing, it's going to be a lot harder for them to do it. Not impossible. We don't have the power to make it impossible for them to do it, but we can certainly make it difficult and maybe move some votes. I mean, Republicans do not have a lot of votes they can lose and still do things. So, if we can make it hard on people like Brian Fitzpatrick and from suburban Pennsylvania and Juan Ciscomani from Tucson, both of whom won incredibly close elections, and some others like that, I think there's a chance to block some of the extreme efforts that we're going to see coming down the road.
If I could just throw a couple other things on it, we do have some great governors around the country who are going to stand firm. My own governor, Josh Shapiro, he's not going to give an inch. I can tell you that right now. And he's certainly not alone in that. Whether you're talking about Governor Pritzker or Governor Newsom or Governor Polis or Governor Healy, there are Governor Murphy in New Jersey. Now that's not going to help people in Texas. It's not going to help people in Alabama, but they're going to stand firm and protect these rights. I think that's key. The following thing I'll mention is kind of it's a dim ray of sunshine, but take what you can get on a cloudy day. Susan Collins of Maine, who is up for re-election in 2 years, is going to chair the Senate Appropriations Committee, the Money Committee. And while we're going to certainly see the reinstitution of the global gag rule, what we're going to try to do is to do what we can to protect the flow of money. Money is oddly enough a little easier to protect sometimes because it's not always the kind of headline grabbing political battle the way a gag rule is. And so, and senators, the one thing all senators have in common is they all want money for their projects. And so having Senator Collins, who is not the strongest, most stalwart ally, but nonetheless, she's on our side in that position, is something where we want to really put some attention on that, try to make sure that she's supporting these programs so that we can at least keep the funding pipeline open during this difficult period.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for that. I want to just kind of touch on a couple other questions that have been asked here related to this premise of pronatalism, which is very tightly linked, I think, to population growth. obviously, but also restrictions on reproductive rights? Is this overall kind of ideology about family structure and family size and the role of women? And a lot of this perhaps also has to do with the sort of political movement or perceived need to increase population growth to account for and maintain economic growth. So there are a couple of questions here asking, and I'll ask you first, John, about this. If there's any data or how we can approach the issue around looking at how economies can thrive with reduced populations, and how can we counter these sort of pronatalist arguments, especially those put forth by Elon Musk, who now has a very sort of intimate role in our government.
We published a book on the subject a few years back, but I think it's still current. The book is called The Good Crisis. Anybody who wants a copy can get one absolutely free by emailing anybody, any of us here, and we're happy to send out the PDF on it. Let me talk about sort of the central premise in the book, which is there was an article co-authored by 2 Harvard professors. Doesn't mean they were right, but that's where they were, and we agree with them. And essentially, the premise here is that a healthy economy, there, Marion Starkey just put a link up to the PDF of the book for anybody who wants to grab it from there. The central premise here is the health of an economy, and we're sort of parking the environment over to the side for just a minute. It's very important, but we're sort of talking about economic health to start with. Requires productivity. A healthy economy has to have high productivity. Well, how do you get high productivity? Well, some of the key factors are you need a healthy workforce. You need a well-educated workforce. That's a lot easier if people have small families. There's literally more resources to go around to make sure that children grow up to be healthy and they get well-educated, they become productive adults. You can also eliminate the barriers that often prevent people, both physical and attitudinal, that can prevent people from being able to participate fully in the economy who want to, whether it's a physical barrier or an attitudinal barrier that sometimes prevents older people from participating, maybe on a part-time basis. There are all kinds of ways you can do that. You know, none of us are richer because the GDP goes up directly. We each have our own GDP. And so, for example, in Japan, they did a study a few years back, and they found that while the population of Japan is going to decline, the per capita GDP is going to continue to go up. And that doesn't solve the environmental issue. I recognize that. But the key here is to say you don't need more people to have a healthy economy. In fact, some of the healthiest economies on Earth, looking at the Scandinavian countries, for example, are places where you have very low fertility rates. And quite frankly, even with all of our challenges, the United States has a very healthy economy in many ways, not all ways. We have some huge gaps, but we also have a pretty healthy economy compared to many other places, and Americans have small families. Incidentally, I've noticed that the vast majority of voices who are pushing this kind of pro-natalist policies are men. Just saying. It seems like they're mostly men who once again are trying to tell women what to do with their bodies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And I wanted to just ask you as well, you talked in the presentation about how it wasn't so long ago that family planning and access to reproductive care and sexual and reproductive health were bipartisan issues. And I'm just wondering, and politics is not my forte here, so I'm learning a lot in this presentation, and perhaps this is a naive question, but I'm wondering, like, do you see any possibility of us getting back there? Are there any Republicans or any politicians who are willing to kind of lean into the vast array of facts associated with the benefits associated with family planning and reproductive health, or are they all kind of doubling down in the other direction?
They are doubling down in the other direction, with the rarest of exceptions, and will continue to do so until they start losing a bunch of elections. And that will, you know, it will happen. It's just got to happen quickly, is my view. We've got to get moving on it. Things can change in politics pretty quickly. I remember walking into the office the morning after Obama was elected, thinking that this is a different country today. I felt the same way the day after Trump was elected 2 weeks ago. It's a different country. So, you know, these are not landslide victories. These are closely fought margins. And when Republicans realize that their set of policies and strategies are not enabling to win elections or win enough elections, you will start to see them either change their minds or get replaced by other politicians who have a better grasp on reality than they do. We just have to try to accelerate that process. By the way, I know we're heading toward the end of the hour. I did want to mention my email address is John, John, at PopConnect, popconnect.org. Anybody who would like to have further dialogue with me directly, I welcome hearing from people. And of course, as Stephanie mentioned, we will do our best to answer any and all questions that we couldn't get to this hour.
Thank you, John. Yeah, it just seems like, I mean, the evidence is so clear and unanimous about just how beneficial family planning and reproductive health is and what the implications are of restricting access. It all seems so logical, but I guess that's not entirely the point when it comes to politics. So thank you.
Well,
go ahead.
You didn't realize it's not a question, but going back to something, Brian, I don't want to talk over you, Brian. I was just going to mention something that you pointed out, that however bad these election results were, and they were, voters did not vote in favor of constraining reproductive rights. That's not what this election was about. And as people start to realize more and more what the import of that is, I think you're going to start seeing things trend in a different direction. Do you want to add something to that, Brian?
No, I was just going to sort of follow up a little to what you had said earlier about like getting, you know, can Republicans come back? I would say the incentive structure in the Republican Party now is completely against that, right? It's all driven toward being the most extreme they can be. I mean, John mentioned Nancy Mace earlier. Like 4 years ago, Nancy Mace was not one of these kinds of Republicans. And now she is, because that's what she's a lot more scared of losing a primary to someone further to her right than she is of losing a general election, because the districts have become so one-sided. So there's nothing in it for her to do what I think she would do in her natural state. So I think until we can sort of address that, and until we can start, until there's electoral consequences for their points of view, as John mentioned, that they have no reason to change. So, one of the goals of our work, grassroots at Population Connection Action Fund, is to sort of try to create those electoral consequences, try to make family planning and reproductive rights an issue that makes them uncomfortable.
Absolutely. And that's a great place to end. Thank you very much, both John and Brian. This was a really interesting and engaging presentation. I certainly learned a lot, and I hope everybody in the audience did as well. There were a lot of questions, some of which we got to, but some of which we weren't able to answer in this time period. So we will follow up via email with responses to each of those. Thank you so much for submitting them and for your attendance here today. It's been great to get together. So have a great day, everyone, and we'll be in touch soon.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.